Good morning, everyone. If you could go ahead and take a seat, we're going to go ahead and get started. It's great to see everyone here. My name is Dan O'Malley. I am the Deputy Editor and Digital Policy Specialist at the Center for International Media Assistance here at the National Endowment for Democracy. And it's really a pleasure to invite you to today's event, Surveillance for Sale, How China and Russia Export Repression Technology, which is co-hosted by my organization, CIMA, and OTF. In addition to those of you in the room, I'd also like to welcome those who are viewing the event live online on YouTube and Facebook. Hello. And for those of you who are active on social media, it'd be great if you could tweet about the event using the hashtags MediaDev and NetDemocracy. We'd love to have a really active online discussion. As many of you know, CIMA is a media development think tank based here at the National Endowment for Democracy. We produce research and analysis that can be used to bolster development of independent media worldwide. And this is because we fundamentally believe that an independent media is crucial for democracy. It holds those in power to account, and it also makes sure that citizens have the information they need to make informed decisions. Increasingly around the world, the internet is where people are going for news. And in some countries, the internet's really the only place that people have access to independent reporting. And this is why attempts by governments to transform the internet into a system of surveillance and censorship represent a fundamental threat to media freedom and really to democracy at large. Today we'll be learning about a new OTF report that documents recent efforts by China and Russia to do just that. There's no doubt that digital authoritarianism is on the upswing worldwide. And as much as we rely on technical experts to help identify these new tools and tactics that are being used for censorship and surveillance, we can't rely entirely on the technical community to implement and find solutions, because at the core, these are really political issues that we're talking about. And that's where the democracy community comes into play. That's why we're here. We need to make sure that democracy advocates are at the forefront of global multi-stakeholder discussions about the future of the internet and digital tech. And this is why CIMA, in partnership with the National Democratic Institute and the Center for International Private Enterprise, have launched the Open Internet for Democracy initiative, which is an effort to empower democracy activists around the world to take the lead in shaping the debate around the future of the internet. So this year we have 6 open internet leaders from Ukraine, Nigeria, Lesotho, Venezuela, Botswana, Zimbabwe, who are going to be doing research on the very topics that we're talking about here today and looking at it, how this takes shape in their own countries, in their own regions. And they really represent a diverse group of journalists, small entrepreneurs, human rights activists, the type of people we really want to make sure are engaged in these debates. And in fact, many of our open internet leaders are joining us on the internet. And I'm sure that this morning's discussion will be invaluable for them as they continue to do their research on the ground. Again, we're extremely happy to have such an esteemed panel for you. And I'd like to personally thank our friends at OTF for making this happen. And I now would like to invite panel moderator Laura Cunningham to the stage. She's the principal director of OTF, and prior to joining OTF, she was the senior advisor for internet freedom at the U.S. State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, where she led the department's internet freedom programs. Before that, she was a program manager for ICT policy at Internews, and in an interesting twist, she actually got her DC start here at CIMA originally as a digital coordinator, organizing and preparing events like this. And so, you know, everyone who works at CIMA knows of the legacy of Laura. So it's really a pleasure to have her back at NED. And if you could come to the stage and go ahead and invite the other panelists. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dan, for that super kind introduction. And thank you all so much for joining us today. As Dan said, I'm Laura Cunningham. I'm the Principal Director of the Open Technology Fund, or OTF. But before I begin, I'd like to thank Seema and Ned for co-hosting this event with us today. As Dan said, I had the wonderful pleasure of working at Seema several years ago, so it's really delightful to be back here today with all of you. I'd also like to thank our esteemed panelists really for traveling from near and far to join us for this important discussion today. We have a really excellent panel, and I'm so excited to hear from all of you. It's especially appropriate that we're here at NED, whose mission it is to support freedom around the world, as we discuss the ways in which authoritarian regimes increasingly use technology to infringe upon and suppress fundamental human rights, both in their own backyards and abroad. At the Open Technology Fund, we work to support freedom worldwide as well, focusing specifically on internet freedom. OTF works to counteract repressive censorship and surveillance around the world by supporting tools and projects that enable citizens in repressive environments to access the uncensored internet and communicate safely online. An essential part of OTF's work is supporting research on emerging censorship and surveillance trends, like the research we're here to launch today, which tracks the spread of Chinese and Russian information controls around the world. But before we dive into that research, I'd like to invite our panelists to join me on the stage and to give some quick introductions. If you guys want to come on up. Great. So first I'd like to introduce Natalia Arnaud, who's the president and founder of Free Russia Foundation, which she co-founded in 2014. Free Russia is a nonprofit, nonpartisan NGO that supports the formulation of an effective and sustainable U.S. policy on Russia. Prior to establishing Free Russia Foundation, Natalia worked for IRI as their Russia country director. We also have Ron Diebert here in the middle, who is a professor of political science and the director of Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. He was also the co-founder of the OpenNet Initiative and the Information Warfare Monitor projects, as well as one of the founders of Siphon. He is also the author of Black Code, Inside the Battle for Cyberspace. Next, we have David Kaye. David is a law professor at the University of California, Irvine, and the UN Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression. In his 2019 book, titled Speech Police, The Global Struggle to Govern the Internet, he explores the way in which companies, governments, and activists struggle to define the rules for online expression. Last, we have Valentin Weber, who is a PhD candidate in cybersecurity at the Center for Doctoral Training in Cybersecurity at the University of Oxford. It's quite the title. His current research focuses on the integration of cyber and grand strategy, as well as the role of information controls in state strategies. He previously worked for the International Security Department at Chatham House. Thank you all again for joining us this morning. We're really delighted to have you. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Valentin, to go over your research report titled The World Wide Web of Chinese and Russian Information Controls. And I'll also give a quick shout out that we have copies of the report just outside these doors if you haven't grabbed one already. All right, great. Thanks, Valentin.
Thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you for Seema for co-hosting and OTF for having supported me throughout the research that has led up to this report. Let me start with, as the report starts, about the definition of the Chinese and Russian models. It's about really about the two models that have been diffusing throughout the world. And I think a quote by Neil Postman captures that quite well. And he says, what Orwell feared were those who would ban books. What Huxley feared was that there would be no reason to ban a book, for there would be no one who would want to read one. And I think, and I argue in the report that China is taking very much the Orwellian approach, where they're doing real-time censorship and very much focusing on that, whereas Russia is focusing on inducing a chilling effect on the population and overwhelming all conversation through propaganda and other means and through that way. But the main part of the report is about tracing the diffusion of those two models and of Russian and Chinese information controls. So how did I approach that? I looked at three indicators. I measured technology, But not only, I looked at the imitation of Russian and Chinese techniques and imitation of laws by other countries. I also looked at mostly Chinese training of law enforcement overseas and private companies training and training of journalists to share techniques. To go to the first one about technology. We did some network measurements and we looked at the internet infrastructure. We found, for instance, Huawei surveillance middle boxes across the world in Colombia, in Pakistan, and Nigeria, for instance. And that was one approach of finding, that was part of the methodology, right? Finding surveillance middle boxes that are capable of doing censoring and censoring and surveillance of the internet infrastructure. We also, I also looked at company reports. I looked at lots of reports from Hikvision, where they sold, where Huawei sold, and so on, and where Dahua, then Vast Experts, a Russian company, Proti, all these companies. I looked at their material, and that's a credible sources, as it's they themselves providing that material. I also looked at countries who declared that they are imitating either the Russian or Chinese approaches. As some of you or many of you know, that in the former Soviet Union, a lot of countries imitate the surveillance bureaucracy, the structure of the surveillance bureaucracy in Russia. They mimic laws and so on. And as regards to China, there have been there were attempts by Thailand, for instance, to mimic the Great Firewall. And most recently, in June, actually, I was reported that Uganda is trying to do something similar. They're trying to nationalize the national internet infrastructure and to control the data that is flowing from inside and outside into the country. And then lastly, the training of law enforcement and other officials and journalists. Just to give you an example, what did I trace? There's a company called Meya Pico, a Chinese company, which trains law enforcement officials around the world, and especially it was instructed, as they say, by the Chinese Ministry of Public Security, that they focus on the Belt and Road Initiative. So they have trained lots of law enforcement officials overseas in digital forensics, how to access laptops, how to access phones of people. And then I would like to say that I've looked at these three indicators, and if one country, let's say, just imported technology or just received training, that will mean that's at the periphery of the so-called technological sphere of the Russian and Chinese technological sphere. But let's say if a country imports technology, if they receive training, and if they're imitating one of the two countries, then they're at the core of the technological sphere. They, that's where, that's how I've categorized that. The fusion has been really broad. It includes countries that are close to the two countries. They're, you know, in the Commonwealth of Independent States, in Asia, but then also farther abroad. There were trainings of journalists in Antigua and Barbuda, in Dominica, in Guyana, in Jamaica, in the Bahamas, all over the world, small island nations, and also large countries. For instance, Vast Experts exported to surveillance technology to Nicaragua. Proti exported to DPI technology, surveillance technology to an island in East Africa, and you can really see it's really broad. And a lot of these countries that have imported are also democracies. Obviously, you might think they won't misuse that technology, but currently, there are no safeguards and no legal law. There are no laws in place to prevent police or government officials of abusing advanced surveillance technology, and there are also authoritarian practices in democracies happening, as you have may noticed. And then I would like also to mention what did I omit from measuring. For instance, technology expert that I didn't want to include in the study. That's, for instance, let's say Hikvision exporting face recognition cameras or surveillance cameras, for instance, to Oxford University. I didn't include that because it is not operated by public authorities, right? It's university employees who are looking, and that's why I didn't include that in the exports. I also didn't exclude exports that are focusing, surveillance exports that are only focusing on the physical infrastructure, right? If it's looking at gas pipelines, it's really about mass surveillance and about controlling people. If we look at the core technospheres, here you've got the core Russian technosphere, mostly close to its borders, but also, especially with the Chinese one, you can see it's going across the Belt and Road Initiative trade routes. And that's quite interesting because it's not really bound to geography, but really where China places an emphasis on or where their interests lie. But what does it mean for Beijing and Moscow to have these technological spheres of influence? I think there are threefold impacts and advantages for them. First of all, it's a political one. They are creating a community of like-minded nations. If you think about the term, you might guess or think about countries that share democratic values, respect for human rights. But what they are creating is a community of like-minded nations of countries which there is no, they have no interest of any checks and balances on surveillance equipment or deployment thereof. And obviously, if their models are being imitated abroad, they've got the greater legitimacy at home to saying, a lot of countries are doing it, we're doing it the right way. There are also economic benefits for Beijing and Moscow. There is a huge surveillance industrial complex in these countries. The whole security industry, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. And they don't want only to sell in China and Russia, but they want to also go abroad. There's the case of Ecuador, where Ecuador is exporting oil to China, and in return it is receiving security-related products. But those security-related products, again, create employment in China. So it's a win-win for China. There are also intelligence benefits for Beijing and Moscow. That is because they are supplying so much of the internet infrastructure. And if we look at surveillance middle boxes, they see those boxes, all the important traffic goes through there. It's really about core internet infrastructure. And if we look at the export of safe cities, right, it's really about public security, it's about everything that matters to a country's national security. And if another country is supplying that technology, this country might also be better at exploiting it. If you build your own house, right, you know where to break in, basically. So what does that mean for the citizens in these technospheres? It means that China, Russia, but also a lot of Western companies, as we will hear later, are increasing the potential of these countries for doing surveillance and for deploying powerful surveillance technology. And we have already seen that in Ecuador, for instance, and that these, for instance, safe cities were used against to monitor dissidents. And they were turned, cameras were turned towards their houses in order to track them. So there is definitely a potential for abuse, and actual abuse already happening. What can we do? I think what we can do is to develop and advance norms of responsible use of such technology in a community of willing nations. And at the moment, even in democracies and in all countries, basically, there are no legal safeguards and checks and balances for responsible use of filtering and surveillance technologies. So we really should be providing an alternative vision to an unchecked vision of the deployment of surveillance and filtering technology and of such techniques. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Valentin. I will now actually turn over to you, David. I think that's a great jumping off point in terms of kind of safeguards and recommendations. I know that you've spent the last year and a half looking at the sale and export of these types of technologies, and in your last report to the UN outlined some of the recommendations and safeguards you think should be put in place in order to protect human rights defenders and journalists from the abuse of these types of technologies. So maybe you could share a little bit more about the research and those recommendations.
Sure. Thank you. And Laura, thanks for inviting me. Seema, thank you for hosting this event. So Valentin's points, I think, are really important, but I also think that it's important for us to see and to really extrapolate from what he was just saying in his last minute or two, that the kind of surveillance technology that is spreading around the world is not simply a province of the Russian and the Chinese surveillance industrial complex. It's in fact, I think many of you probably know of the different instances in which governments have been using the same kinds of technology, but purchased from Western vendors. And so we do have, I think, really quite clearly a global problem. And it may be that some of the vendors and some of the exporting countries may be more, let's say, subject to the kind of public pressure and advocacy that my report talks about. And there may be other countries, I'm not naming names, that may be less susceptible to that kind of advocacy. So I want to just step back and suggest, and be really pretty brief because the panelists are so great here, to maybe step back and think of this in two different ways. So one way to think about the problem is a problem of use, right? So that is, which are the countries that I'm putting aside how they get the technology, but what are the controls on the technology's use in different countries? And if you look around the world at the places where these technologies are being used, and it's not just authoritarian countries, and as Citizen Lab has showed in many different contexts, whether we're talking about Mexico or we're talking about surveillance of journalists outside of authoritarian places. So, for example, Ethiopian American based in Maryland. There are many examples of this kind of technology being used in non-authoritarian regimes or non-authoritarian environments. There's very little control even in those contexts. So just to give the example of Mexico, there was, I would say it's an ongoing scandal around the use of some of the technology that it seems like comes from NSO Group in Israel, the Pegasus malware, that was used to target opposition figures, journalists, even UN officials, not myself, I don't think, although you haven't really scrubbed my phone. Yeah. So we've seen that, and there's been very little accountability for it. There's been very little control beforehand for how that kind of technology is used, who authorized it, and so forth. So there's one problem around the use. There is clearly a human rights framework around both privacy and freedom of expression that this technology interferes with, that really demands that governments demonstrate a necessity to restrict, whether it's privacy or expression, in any given instance, and there's been very little showing of that. So that's the first part, is the use. The second part is the sale and transfer of this technology, and much as in the case of China and Russia, there's not much control over the export. The same is true when it comes to Western vendors. There's very little control, and to the extent there is control, it's very often the case that that control is somewhat secretive. We don't actually know, for example, what a government's export control policy and process might have led to in the context of, say, one application to transfer a particular surveillance technology overseas. The Wassenaar arrangement, which is the dual-use technology arrangement that typically applies to military tools, does have some measure of covering this kind of technology. But because Wassenaar is really a military-oriented framework for export controls, it doesn't deal with the human rights responsibilities of states when it comes to exporting or allowing for the export of this technology. So we have a problem both in terms of the use and in terms of the controls over its export. And then the last thing I would just say is, obviously, at the center of that is the companies who are actually developing the technology and exporting it. So putting aside the fact that many of them either are or maybe avoiding export controls, the fact is they have responsibilities also. The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which was adopted by the Human Rights Council in 2013, actually provides that not only do states have obligations, but companies that have an impact on human rights also have responsibilities. And of course, it's a non-binding arrangement. It basically says to companies, you need to be adopting basic tools of human rights impact assessment when you develop and share technology in instances like this. And as far as we can tell, none of the companies that are involved in this trade are doing this. Now, and this is where maybe we can conclude on a slightly hopeful note. The NSO group, with its new ownership, has been suggesting that, and so NSO Group is the Israeli company that develops Pegasus software and is involved in a lot of the different issues that have been public, certainly in Western media over the last year or two. They're suggesting that they are going to be adopting a human rights framework for both the establishment of their technologies moving forward and the transfer of it. I mean, the proof is in the pudding, right? I mean, we'll have to see what that actually amounts to. But there clearly has been some impact of public advocacy and I think publicly available research done by organizations like Citizen Lab that's had an impact on NSO Group. The other thing that I think is interesting is the State Department in just the last week or two has a kind of draft set of guidance for companies as to how they can implement their human rights responsibilities in the export of this technology. I think that's a good step. It's worth, that also would be non-binding as far as I understand, but I think it's really useful for us to take a look at that and see whether these are the first steps in moving to something that's a little bit more concrete and ultimately creating some measures of accountability both on the companies that are producing and transferring this technology and the governments that are allowing it to be transferred and the governments that are using it. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David. Ron, Citizen Lab has been tracking the diffusion of these technologies for many years, and you've also made several recommendations about how we can better create human rights safeguards around them. In addition to looking at the spread of these technologies, Citizen Lab has also really been kind of a leading organization in understanding how the technologies are being deployed and against whom. So maybe you could share with us a little bit more about what the deployment of these technologies actually looks like on the ground and how that can help us kind of shape the types of recommendations or regulations we might think about.
Sure, okay. And thank you, Laura, for the invitation to come here, and congratulations, Valentin, on your research and your report. So much to talk about here, so I'll try to be brief as well. A bit of background about the Citizen Lab for those of you who don't know. We're based at the University of Toronto. We're a research organization. Our focus is on information control issues that arise out of human rights concerns. We've been around since 2001, so we've been doing this for a long time. Plenty to talk about in this area. I guess the signature of the Citizen Lab is our mixture of methods. So I'm a political scientist, international security person by training and background, but most of the staff at the Citizen Lab come from different disciplines like law and area studies. We especially leverage computer science and engineering science. A lot of our work is technical in nature, and we use these very powerful methods that come from these disciplines to essentially pry open the internet and the devices that we carry in our pockets to find out what's going on beneath the surface that may present an issue from a human rights perspective. One of the areas that we've been working on is around this topic, commercial surveillance technology. Usually the work that we do in this area begins with what we call a patient zero. This is somebody who maybe receives a suspicious text message or an email with an attachment. One of these patient zeros is a person named Mansour, who's a human rights defender in the United Arab Emirates. And in 2016, he received a text message on his iPhone purporting to show evidence of torture. Oh, sorry. My mic is not on. Give me a second. How's that? Better?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So Ahmad Mansour, human rights defender in the UAE, in 2016, he receives a text message on his iPhone purporting to show evidence of torture in Emirati prisons. It's the type of thing he might be tempted to click on. Fortunately for him, he didn't. He passed it to us for analysis. And what we did is typical for the type of work that we do. We actually clicked on that link in a controlled environment in a laboratory setting, infected our own device, and infected our phone with Pegasus software manufactured by this Israeli company that David mentioned, NSO Group. That particular exploit took advantage of what was then an unpatched vulnerability on the iPhone. So this is a very precious commodity. It runs upwards of like $1 million an exploit. We did a responsible disclosure to Apple, published our report, and then in the course of doing this research, we noticed that similar concerns were being raised, people receiving similar types of text messages with domains that we knew were connected to NSO Group's infrastructure in Mexico. And that led us to a whole series of cases that you alluded to, where we saw that this technology that is being marketed, by the way, to governments, to law enforcement and militaries, as something to assist states in their battle against terrorism or child pornography or criminal investigations, was actually being used to target human rights defenders, journalists, lawyers, basically the whole spectrum of civil society. In Mexico, they even targeted research scientists who were advocating for attacks on sugary beverages. So health scientists, basically. So really out of control abuse of this type of technology in the context of Mexico. Beginning in 2016, one of the researchers in the Citizen Lab, Bill Marzak, basically scanning the entire internet. He does this every day, 24 hours a day. He has a system set up where he's constantly checking for the signatures that we've developed that allow us to see NSO Group's infrastructure. Even though it's a very sophisticated Israeli surveillance company, even they leave digital traces that you can find if you know where to look. So we basically, as a output of this research, we were able to map the entire infrastructure and determine who were the clients of NSO Group's technology and where were these espionage operations going in terms of countries. And what we found was a really disturbing picture. So there were more than 30 countries that were using NSO Group's technology to engage in espionage operations against targets in more than 40 countries. So this is one company symptomatic of a much larger problem, right, of the proliferation of this type of very powerful surveillance technology. Once it gets inside your device, even something as secure as an iPhone, they can basically follow you around, look at wherever you're traveling, who you're meeting with. They can activate the camera, microphone, basically turning a device into a silent wiretap in your pocket. So if anyone's phone was infected in this room right now, they'd be able to hear everything that we're doing, know exactly who's in this room meeting with each other, and so on. In the course of doing that one investigation about the global proliferation of NSO Group's technology, we noticed there was an infection in Canada, which is, of course, where we're based. We're very interested. And it seemed to be coming from an operator based in Saudi Arabia using Israeli surveillance technology. So we actually set out to try to identify who this target might be. And after doing some field work and talking to people, we actually located the target. And that person is Omar Abdul Aziz, who's basically a person who runs a YouTube channel, satirical channel. It's very critical of Mohammed bin Salman. He's been threatened for the work that he has done. He sought asylum in Canada. He now is a permanent resident. And he was targeted using this surveillance technology. Our report on Omar came out October 1st. Very next day, I received a text message from Omar saying, "Oh my goodness, I'm very scared. Jamal has gone missing." And at that point, I had no idea who Jamal Khashoggi was. Vaguely heard of him, but I didn't really understand. Of course, the next day, he was tragically murdered, executed in the consulate in Turkey. So what had happened here was that Saudi intelligence, using this very sophisticated surveillance technology sold by an Israeli firm, was used by the Saudi government to basically intercept all of the communications of Khashoggi's associates. We don't know if I assume they probably targeted his device as well, but we unfortunately were not able to get a hold of his device. So they basically captured the communications of Omar, Jamal Khashoggi, who were close confidants. They were planning all sorts of things, and this surveillance exposed all of that. So the bottom line here is what we're seeing is this technology that's marketed to governments to assist law enforcement and intelligence is in fact being used to target civil society. And it's not actually surprising given the context here. So most of the governments that we're talking about, unfortunately, are autocracies, authoritarian governments, or even governments like Mexico that are on paper democracies, have all sorts of corruption problems, lack of accountability, and lack of transparency, and so on. And so the rub of all of this is that there's a real crisis here. I see this as like a silent epidemic that's really eroding civil society from the inside out. And you know, this is ironic. When I started this work back in the 1990s and the early 2000s, come to meetings like this at the National Endowment of Democracy, there's all sorts of enthusiasm about digital technologies and the internet, how this would facilitate democratization and liberalization. What we're actually seeing now is the opposite. It's creating an erosion of global civil society unless we do something about it. I'm pretty pessimistic. Hopefully in this conversation we can get into some of the ways in which we might remediate some of this, which I consider to be frankly an emergency, because otherwise the prospect for democracy and liberal democracy down the road in civil society looks pretty bleak.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. I think that's a great call to action. And Natalia, to kind of wrap things up here, I know that you have seen and experienced the deployment of some of these technologies firsthand and the way that they can be used to target civil society. And so wanted to hear a little bit more about your experience, but also what you think it means that these technologies are now being deployed to 110 countries around the world for civil society globally.
Thank you so much, Laura, and really grateful to CIMA and ED, Open Technologies Fund, for this outstanding panel with great panelists, great audience. As my friend Danila Golpirovich just said, this panel has all the right keywords, China, Russia, and civilians, so that I would actually prefer to be among the audience instead of being here on the stage, but I'll try to be brief, and I'll try to, again, not understanding much about technical aspects of this, but being like a live target all the time for many, many years. I'll give you some examples from my experience, but also maybe tying it into some historic perspective. Our panelists discussed here how Russia and China are on the forefront of this digital authoritarianism, and maybe let's discuss how and why Russia is now where it is. As you probably know, as soon as Putin got to power almost 20 years ago, it's just crazy even to think about this big number when an entire generation of young Russians don't know anything else on the screens of their televisions, that only one leader, and don't know any, they have never observed a democratic changeover of the government in their entire life. But yes, almost 20 years ago when Putin came to power, his main focus was on media. This was one of the first things that he did, media capture, taking major mainstream media under Kremlin's control, and then very fast taking more and more media outlets, regional, federal, private, under Kremlin's control. And for years, for us, pro-democracy movement and civil society in Russia, internet was an island of freedom. So we could discuss many things. This is how we communicated with almost with limited or almost zero access to traditional media. Again, internet was a place where we can express our opinions, where we can communicate with each other, with our supporters. But I think the situation completely changed around 2010, 2011, when the social media fueled the Arab Spring, and when we saw how, like in an instant, so many, like hundreds of thousands of people can get organized, can go to streets and protest. And we saw that so many regimes fell under this pressure of mass protests. And this was a time when Kremlin understood that instead of investing billions in television, it's really they should start thinking about internet much more. The Kremlin observed Twitter revolutions, they watched it very closely. And after that, especially after this parliamentary elections of 2011 in Russia, drew the biggest mass protest in Moscow and many other cities since the collapse of the Soviet Union. This was probably the turning point for the Kremlin when they started to understand that internet is not just for us, not a like island of freedom, or not for the tool to control and to manage civil society in Russia, and so that before that we were blowing off steam of our discontent online much more than in the streets. But all these Twitter revolutions and the civic rise of the civic protest movement in Russia made the Kremlin to turn against the internet as a relatively free thing. And this is approximately the time when we started to understand what SORM is, this Soviet-era surveillance technology. We were massively under surveillance 24/7. We knew that all our emails are read, all our phone conversations are recorded. Even going to the bathroom, we were assuming there are cameras there, which wasn't pleasant, but again, you get used to this. This is when emails of many opposition leaders, including Alexei Navalny, were hacked and then leaked to pro-Kremlin media, or phone conversations of, again, opposition leaders like Boris Nemtsov were recorded and leaked again. And but our panelists are right, it's not only the use of these technologies inside repressive regimes. In 2012, I was forced with my team to flee from Russia. We moved to Europe, but even there we felt under constant surveillance, and actually even more than in Russia. I felt myself under surveillance in EU and NATO countries than inside Russia. But also the methods how the Kremlin was using all this after Bolotnaya protest, it was the techniques how they were randomly picking protesters and putting them to jail, discouraged for many years, discouraged Russians to protest in unsanctioned rallies. They started to do the same online. They started to randomly pick people for online expressions, and we have a person who is in jail now for 5 years for just a simple tweet. There is a girl who is facing 6 years for being associated with so-called undesirable organization, and all her online statements or how she was organizing a debate through Facebook, they are the main reasons for her house arrest. And many examples like that, when people are again in jail just for simple likes, posts, shares, catching Pokemons in a church, things like that. I personally and my organization, Free Russia Foundation, as soon as we started to get traction, started to have some impact, we like under constant attack. Every day I wake up and I see that there was some phishing attack on some of my accounts or my colleagues' accounts. In 2017, we released a very important report, Kremlin Gas Games in Europe. And we were discussing with one of the opposition leaders and experts on politics, economics, energy, Vladimir Milov, who's economic advisor to Alexei Navalny, Russian opposition leader, how we can promote our report through the Navalny YouTube channel, which is very popular in Russia. And so, of course, thinking that it's a private phone conversation, then we heard it from all these major television stations in many recycled ways through different documentaries and TV shows and so on. This summer we released a groundbreaking report, Misrule of Law, how the Kremlin uses Western institutions to undermine the West, and we understood that this is something which is really very important research, because it was first of all written by Russian, American, Eastern and Western European experts all together being on the same page, and again exposing all these Kremlin's malign activities in the West, including through digital means. But we understood that it's important for the Kremlin because on the day of our launch, our website was DDoSed. It was down for many hours, but that was prior to our main presentation at the US Congress. Second main DDoS attack was before our Chatham House presentation in London when we were doing European tour promoting this report. But again, all these technologies, they are trying to do that, but people resist. And instead of they couldn't access our report online, but they started to spread it and publish on different websites. So actually much more people read it. So the effect was absolutely opposite. Unlike China, Russia is with its total filtration of content, Russia relies more on self-censorship, as I said, because of this randomly picking activists, but also on, of course, this repressive legislation. And starting from 2012, the Kremlin started to adopt lots of draconian laws, and many of them are connected to this digital activism. So we have blocking websites, we have prohibiting VPNs, many legislation with new versions of legislation on extremism, terrorism, separatism. They include these online statements, and people are prosecuted for that. We have now more than 100,000 websites blocked, and more than 4 million web pages, and so it's a lot of limitation of access. It's having a blacklist of NGOs in their websites, including ours. It's actually some curious coincidence, like on June 28th, David Kay was also one of our keynote speakers at the event, which we conducted in The Hague for symbolic reasons, and the event was about discussing how to counter Kremlin's disinformation while respecting freedom of speech. But 30 minutes after our event was over, we received the news from Putin's Russia that our organization has been designated as undesirable, and it led to another level of attack and legislative consequences. Like again, our Roskomnadzor, this agency that does censorship in Russia, they put us into the blacklist, and actually they started to harass different high-tech companies in the West, like YouTube, saying that we are now prohibited in Russia, they should block our YouTube channel. And which is again, the Kremlin physically forced me flee from Russia. Now they're trying to silence me, like in this new environment in the West. And but again, there are many other repressive tools that Kremlin is doing and exporting. Factory of trolls invented in Russia, and now is like everywhere in so many countries. This surveillance technology that we discussed, again, blocking, harassing, new repressive legislation, everything else. But what is the most important here, and I will be optimistic, if I may, otherwise I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing, is that it's not that much about technologies. They're important, but they're just tools, they're means. It's much more important what are our ideas, who are our leaders, and these ideas will find their ways to people. We didn't have Facebook 15 years ago, we didn't have Instagram 10 years ago. Before that, Kremlin was investing into the television, that was the main technology, and they understood that, again, Russian youth doesn't watch TV at all, so it was absolutely waste of money concerning this youth generation. So. And also, while they're trying to sow fear, while again by randomly picking activists and putting them to jail and doing things like that, people resist, and people they're not scared. They continue. What is happening now in Russia gives me a lot of optimism. Again, in 2017, we saw a rise of youth protest, and those young people, again, as I said, they didn't see anybody else but only Putin on TV screens. They didn't care about him. For them, he's just an outdated dictator, and all the tricks that they're trying to do, they're just recycling the same methods. What else can Putin offer them? Wrestling more animals, I don't know. Diving again, and instead of 2,000 BCM for picking up 5,000 BCM for it's just not in use anymore. It's not interesting. And again, this new generation gives me a lot of hope, and that people don't have fear. Thank you.
I appreciate you ending it on an optimistic note and reminding us how resilient and creative and adaptive civil society can be. I know that we have a big crowd, probably with a lot of questions. I'm going to use my moderator privilege to come back to each one of you with one question quick, and then we will open it up to the rest of the crowd. So Valentin, I wanted to start with you. You've obviously kind of retroactively traced back the diffusion of this technology to these 110 countries around the world. But I would love to hear from you about what you think that holds for the future and how you see these trends moving forward. So maybe give us a sense for how you see this diffusion moving forward and what this means for the technospheres of the future.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So I think a lot of these projects, whether it's technological selling or selling of surveillance equipment, whether it's trainings, they are already underway. Those are projects that have been ongoing. They will just deepen. They will just be continuing into the future. As regards to Russia, I think the most deep or the core technosphere will stay the same, right? It will mostly remain there. The most of the technology exports and the imitation of those countries, I think it will stay there. As regards to China, I think as the its footprint around the world is increasing, and especially as it is encouraging the integration or the socializing of law enforcement personnel, of journalists within the Belt and Road Initiative. It is trying to socialize them into a its understanding of how to control information. So I think there will be more and more countries around those trade routes which will start belonging to or be part of that technological sphere. We have, it's almost like a structural change. You have Meyapico, the company, which is part of that safety corridor from China to Europe, which includes training law enforcement personnel in that safety corridor project. That project has been going on for 3 years, and it's just continuing and increasing in size. So that's thousands of people. Then the China Public Diplomacy Association will train over 1,000 journalists across the world in and expose them to authoritarian media landscape. And so there's a slow change happening concerning people and the spreading of techniques. And I think there will these trends will continue and deepen that way. Yeah.
Great. And then, David, I think to you, one of the statements that you made a number of times is around recommendations for more safeguards, but you acknowledged here today that it's unlikely that every government is going to be willing to adopt those types of safeguards, and I think Valentin has pointed out probably two who are unlikely to. Why do you think it's still important for the creation consensus around those types of safeguards and regulations from Western democracies, even if we can't get global consensus?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a really important question, and it's actually not that easy to answer, because obviously if we were to say, for example, that the Western European, North American, and Israeli companies were to to adopt the kind of safeguards that we're talking about, and that their countries, so not just the companies, but the countries would also adopt these kinds of safeguards, right? The argument is, well, then the Russian and the Chinese technosphere, if that's what we're calling it, will expand to satisfy those markets, and that's probably, I mean, that would be maybe a source of pessimism to share with Ron on that point. But I really don't think the answer is. I mean, there's two different responses, maybe. So I don't think the answer is, well, then the Western companies should do nothing, or Western governments should do nothing. I think, first of all, if you look at the map that Citizen Lab has shown, it doesn't overlap totally neatly with the technosphere from China and Russia. So there's a spread of this technology that goes well beyond what the Chinese and the Russian companies are selling and transferring. So there's a real benefit to safeguards, at least in those countries that are bound by rule of law. The second part of it is, I think it's going to be increasingly difficult for Western countries to advocate that, for controls by the Chinese or the Russians if they themselves are not controlling it. And so I think that, there is an element, it's not just a kind of altruistic thing, like we should do better because we're good people. That's obviously not the way the world works. But I think that in order to make those kinds of arguments, those countries that are maybe I don't even really want to say predisposed to rule of law, because I don't know if that's actually true any longer. But countries that know better and that have active civil society, like us in this room, are able to enjoy, should be advocating for that. And so I think that there's a real a political reason to do this in addition to, the reasons that go to enabling people to actually enjoy their human rights without interference.
Absolutely. Ron, I'm going to try and flip you to think optimistically
Yeah.
for a moment with us. You described kind of this proliferation of surveillance technology as an epidemic. But I'm wondering, with the group of people we have today, what, as international NGOs, donors, policymakers, or researchers, can we do to at least help to kind of mitigate this tide, if not stop it completely?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, I do think there's a crisis right now, and we need to frankly address that in the same way that we think about climate change as a crisis. You first have to acknowledge we got a big problem here. We got to deal with it. And I think there's, structurally speaking, there is a kind of market failure around civil society when it comes to cybersecurity. So if governments or big companies are hit with a big cyber attack, they can go out and hire a private company like CrowdStrike or Mandiant, pay millions of dollars to outfit them with the latest equipment, do some kind of remediation, figure out who's attacking them and so on. But the typical NGO doesn't have this sort of capacity, right? And of course, we're speaking about civil society in a generic sense, but we're talking in practice about a lot of different groups in different regions of the world with varying capacities and sizes. You have sometimes organizations that, barely can deal with the printer, let alone deal with advanced persistent threats coming from China, Russia, or Israel. So that's where I think we have to start. And there are some groups that, of course, doing really good things. OTF itself, right, has really been working hard, trying to build capacity, sponsor the development of technologies that will protect civil society. That's great. Other organizations, Access Now, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, like there are groups that are mobilized around this issue. We just need more of it, right? We really need to encourage that. And I spend a lot of time at the international level around these discussions of cybersecurity norms, and I came away really disillusioned. I'm not confident that right now anyway, given the international context that we're in, which is really is a deterioration of norms internationally. No better sign of that, I think, can be found than at the G20 meeting. I think it was days after Khashoggi was murdered, Putin and Mohammed bin Salman basically giving each other a high five. Like that to me was like a symbol of where we're at internationally in terms of the normative environment. So I don't hold out much hope that we'll be able to convince governments, given the current leadership. I'm not even going to mention the name in this country, but it's not unique in that regard. So we need to start at the grassroots level, and I think begin by first of all addressing that lack of capacity. That should come from the donors, the foundations, organizations like NED and others. And then I think once we build up the capacity, we need to start thinking about resistance. And that's maybe sounds like a strong term, but I think that's where we're at right now as well. Not exactly sure what that would look like. Finally, one thing I think we have to acknowledge, and I call it a kind of painful truth. The topic that we're discussing here is mostly focused on governments, but we have to admit that we live in a political economy of surveillance capitalism, right? And we talk a lot about dual use technologies, but forget that everything that we're talking about here begins at a consumer level with the products that we actually wittingly and willingly download onto our phones that basically drill into our personal lives, follow us around. The same technologies that can be used for these consumer applications are very beneficial to law enforcement and public safety and autocrats around the world, and it's hugely lucrative. This is where Big Brother meets big data. I think we have to kind of look in the mirror and say, wait a minute, what are we doing here? And I like the fact that now there's a dawning recognition that we've kind of sleptwalked into this political economy of surveillance capitalism. It's undermining public discourse. It's facilitating the spread of authoritarian practices, and we need to do something about that too. And of course, that's a very daunting challenge in and of itself.
And I'm so glad that you brought up the point around big data as well, because I think that's hugely important. And while we didn't have a ton of time to dig into it, hopefully we'll have some questions from the audience along those lines as well. Natalia, last question, similar question to you actually. What more can we do to help organizations like yours, to help civil society, to make them more resilient in the face of these types of threats? What would you like to see more of, or less of, or how can we do better?
Thank you so much. I think in any circumstances and whatever is happening, don't lose optimism. It's always great to believe in what you are doing. Well, in all these things, Russia before that was famous for, I don't know, cosmos and ballet. Now we know that Russians are very good at hacking and providing surveillance technologies. But also, pro-democracy Russians are very good at being resilient to repressive regimes, and it just seems that those again, dictatorships, they are strong, but actually they are just monsters with clay feet, and we as a society, we can again outsmart all of them. And here, us pro-democracy Russians can be a very good resource of information for Western democracies. We know how to resist them better. We you started to talk about hacking, I don't know, 3 years ago. Again, Navalny was hacked 10 years ago. We can tell you more how these regimes operate and how we can resist them. So it was time when, again, Western democracies were training emerging democracies how to do democratization. Now we can also train you how to resist to authoritarian regimes like Russia. But also more sharing information. It's a lot of things, a lot of times we just invent the same wheels. Like again, all this in Russian civil society has great success stories, but they are not told. Everything what is being told here is again the threat of Russia, again equating Russia to Putin, but not seeing that Russian civil society is growing. It has a lot of success stories, including in this digital space. But also, it seems like it's a little bit isolated, that Russian civil society can take so much from Hong Kong protests, for example, and vice versa. And there are some little platforms for us to interact, to learn from each other. And I think this is what actual donors can do, is to provide those platforms for us.
And I think that's a fantastic point. I think one of the points that Valentin made in his report is around the imitation of this censorship and surveillance model that Russia and China are promoting. And so while governments are quickly learning from one another, I think it's incredibly important, like you said, that we're able to kind of share lessons learned and best practices across civil society to make sure we're able to keep pace as well and learn from one another. So we have about 30 minutes left, and so I'd like to turn to the audience, and there are a number of hands in the air. Excellent. We're going to have a good conversation. To have a few people ask questions, and I think we've got roving mics. Do we want to start up here in the front, and then we can move slowly back into the audience? If you could, just introduce yourself, and if you want to direct your question at a specific speaker, just let us know who it is.
Thank you very much. I don't know if it works.
No.
Voice of America Russian Service. My question is to Mr. Weber. Did you compare which country, or rather which administration is more developed in this technologies, Russia or China? And did you see any signs of real alliance between these two countries in not only promoting these technologies, but to helping each other to control, suppress opposition with these technologies, just like exchange? So do we see any political strata in this cooperation? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I think it's mutual learning between each other. They exchange knowledge. However, I think the major stream of information and of technology is from China to Russia. And it's you have safe cities being built in St. Petersburg and Moscow. You had like Chinese, the architects of the Great Firewall visiting Russia. You've got Russia, which wants to exchange Cisco equipment with Huawei equipment and so on. So there's these indications. It's interesting actually as regards to cooperation. There is interestingly overlapping, I would say, technospheres within Central Asia. And there both countries are very, very active, and I think that's where they could also, their interests might collide as regards to how they supply equipment and so on. As regards to those, are overlapping kind of technospheres. As regards to the sophistication of technology, I would argue that China's is much more sophisticated, just because you have a much bigger market much more money to flow into that industry and to develop these technology. You can see that in the exports actually, and see what each country exports, right? You can see, I think it's in the appendix of the paper, you can see the vast diversity of technology that comes out of China, whereas what comes out of Russia is mostly the inspection technology for surveillance purposes, not so much facial recognition and other services that are prevalent in Chinese exports.
Adam Powell from the University of Southern California. To Ron, I believe you mentioned in passing technologies which are being used to sift through the internet day and night. Might this be part of the response? Can these technologies be used to detect other bad actors, other forms of action, for example, against democratic elections in Western countries? And if so, is that something which might be the glass half full? Mm-hmm. And finally, could that also be something which could be crowdsourced?
Yep. Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you for bringing that up. One of the things I'm very passionate about is I believe that universities and university-based research not only could but should be doing more to address what is really a crisis in the global public sphere. And there's a mythology around the origins of the internet, that it's a military project and so on. I've always seen it as very much anchored in the university. A lot of the norms around how the internet operates and so on comes from principles that emerge out of the university system. And it is, after all, our repository of shared information. It's the means through which we communicate globally. The job of the university is to act as a custodian of that. So I think that the universities, I'm talking in a general sense, should be standing up and addressing the crisis around internet freedom. And how do you do that? I believe it's by effectively duplicating the type of research that we do at Citizen Lab. So all of our methods are peer-reviewed, transparent, and reproducible. It's challenging work, but it's not rocket science. And I constantly advocate for there to be more Citizen Lab-like research centers at other universities. We have far more problems out there than we can tackle as one small research group. If there were a dozen Citizen Labs out there doing the type of work that we're doing, it would act, I believe, as a pretty effective, maybe not a constraint on bad behavior, but it would certainly illuminate a lot more that's going on. And there have been some really interesting developments in this area. Valentin did some network measurement tests. I can remember 10 years ago when we first started those with Open Net Initiative, we were using poorly constructed software that we developed ourselves. Well, now you have Open Observatory of Network Interference, a global project constantly monitoring the internet for network interference. It's a great model of the type of crowdsourcing that you're recommended. So I'm very passionate about this. I think, again, it's one of those grassroots from below efforts that could help protect and preserve the internet as a forum for free and open communications.
Hi, Dahlia Peterson, Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown University. So I'd like to hear from everyone to refine down a little bit what constitutes bright lines in surveillance technologies. This is something that I've tried to chew a lot with, honestly not much success so far. Where can we really draw the line in terms of what constitutes acceptable use of these technologies, and where in some cases we have to think about how it could be merited, and that could provide us much stronger negotiation ground for discussing within our own countries and with other countries. So just really curious to see what you think. Thank you.
Anybody
Maybe
wanna-
I'll take a first stab at that. So, there's different ways to think about where to draw lines. And the one line that, rather than, and maybe I'll let my co-panelists address the substantive place for that line drawing, but one place where we don't see many lines at all is on the process and procedure side, and so the rule of law questions. So there clearly is a legitimate role for law enforcement and the use of certain kinds of surveillance. I mean, I don't think that's under so much question, although we can talk about the nature of digital surveillance being different than other forms of surveillance. But I think one of the critical problems that we face right now is just a complete and utter lack of safeguards. Very little rule of law standard, very little either judicial warranting of surveillance technology and the use of surveillance, and very little oversight, even if you do have judicial warranting of surveillance use. So I mean, I think it's useful, and in some respects, it's easier to focus on those easy to identify rule of law kinds of questions than in the, like, where is surveillance valid and where is it not? Although that also is an important discussion to have, but I'm starting from the perspective of there's nothing out there at all, virtually, in terms of controlling its spread or controlling its use, and we need to at least start there.
Hi, my name is Allison Bartel, and I work for Internews Asia programs. I'm usually based in Bangkok, so I'm focused more on how these technologies are emerging in Southeast Asian contexts. But you look at the market base for these technologies, especially mobile technology, similar to what Ron was mentioning earlier, and a lot of these populations have either come online in the last couple years or about to come online for the first time, and many of them are not, civil society activists. So maybe privacy is not the most important thing to them when they're making these choices. They would rather have mobile technology that's cheap and effective rather than totally private, and maybe they even know the risks. In that context, what are the levels or like the levers of accountability for the companies that are exporting the technologies?
Ron,
Sure, I'll take a crack at that. I think you point to something very important, and that is, we, generally speaking, all of us rely on these large technological platforms, and they weren't designed with security in mind. Security is really an afterthought when it comes to the development of a lot of this technology. Move fast and break things is the philosophy around all of the Silicon Valley entrepreneurship, and it's created many great things, allowed us to do awesome stuff, Facebook, Instagram, so on. But the security around it has been not at the foundation, if you will. It's been something that's dealt with ex post facto, usually after a major breach, and then there's some Band-Aid solution, and you're building effectively a house of cards around what we rely on, not just for the day-to-day things, but really critical stuff relating to our healthcare and education and so on. The platforms really need to step up more and take this, not just with respect to like espionage, but also with respect to disinformation, better manage their platforms. And this is a slippery slope. David's written a whole book about this, so I would turn it over to him on this topic. But and if they're not going to do it, well, then that's where we need to step in and regulate them. Of course, there's a big shadow here, which Valentin has pointed out with his report, is live at a time when the initial wave of digital technologies came from California. They embodied some of this West Coast libertarian philosophy, but very soon already we're starting to see this is being overtaken by technologies developed principally in China that embody within them a much different philosophical foundation, if you will. Most of them have within them not only surveillance by design, which the Western technologies do as well, but by law, they're required to share all of the data they collect with authorities. And that's at the foundation of all of this. So I think consumers need to be educated about that. And there is a kind of mythology around digital technology. It's like magic, we don't think much beyond the screen in front of us. We send an email and it magically appears on the other side of the world, which is why I'm glad you pointed out a lot of the infrastructure that supports all of this. We need to tear it apart and look beneath the surface, not only of the fiber optics and all of that, all of which is very important, but with inside these devices as well. We need to do a job of educating people about the risks that they face when they entrust all of this data to these third parties who in turn are sharing them with government authorities. It may seem like, well, I don't have much to hide, but gradually the spaces for free expression, access to information are narrowing. And that's a problem for everybody, not just activists.
Actually, I want to take off from that point also. And so there's something else that's happening in addition to the surveillance, so sort of the offense part, and that is there's increasingly law that undermines individual digital security. So in Russia, you've seen this kind of legislation that is specifically designed essentially to make illegal the use of encryption technologies, as an example. And you see that in many parts of the world under the guise of cybersecurity laws. So I mean, maybe this adds to the pessimism that Ron was discussing, but I think that if you tie together the reality that so much of one's life is on these digital devices, and that it's not just about some kind of, like I'm not doing anything criminal, but it's my health care, it's my banking, and so forth. If we can, I think part of it is education, and then also advocacy around protecting not just the freedom of expression issues, which are important, I mean essential, but also protecting those basics of our daily lives. Like that has to also make its way into legislation and to opposing the kind of legislation we see that makes it easier. I mean, it's really kind of softening the environment for surveillance.
Hi, my name's Elizabeth. I run IRI's China program. My question sort of picks up a little bit on what you were just talking about. I really like the quote that you began the entire presentation with, although I would like to push back on the idea that China doesn't have a lot of self-censorship. I've been working in the region for 5 years, and in fact, there's a great deal of self-censorship among the general public. And I mean, you're also seeing a lot of pressure on the universities right now. And it just seems to be a real growing sense of apathy and acceptance within the general public in China that this is just the way that it's going to be. And even Natalia mentioned in Russia, she got used to video cameras potentially in the washroom. We see this all of the time in China in the general public. And so my question relates to sort of how this psychological pressure of living in a surveillance state that is so pervasive impacts the general public's perception of this and just accepting it ad nauseum. And what can we do to counter that among the general public? Because if they are lost and they accept it, we are all lost. There's nothing else that we can do about that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes. At first, it's a very chilling effect, and then when you have all this surveillance, when you have all the leaks, everything else, you start really distrust. You start thinking, how do I communicate with people? What messenger I use? Do I do Signal? Do I do Proton Mail? That was also like lots of hacks through this, and but at some point you just you do your work. You start thinking about people. You start thinking about trust. Who you trust and what this person is comfortable with, how to communicate. But also then slowly, like at first, yes, there was a big distraction of participating in unsanctioned rallies, expressing ourselves online, sending SMS. But then you cannot live in fear all the time. And then more and more people start to join your course. And what's happening in Russia, it's actually interesting how the Russian civil society uses those technologies. Well, what this Kremlin farms and bots and trolls, what they were doing is they were trying to, for example, dislike very popular videos of opposition leaders and so on, and so that people couldn't see them. But now it's vice versa. They're using these tactics against them. There was just recently absolutely amazing story how pro-Kremlin rap artist made a song glorifying the Kremlin and everything else, and within 24 hours there were 1 million dislikes that they had to take it down. Or when there is some flash mob and there is a person, an actor, who was sentenced to 3.5 years to jail for just protesting, and actually he wasn't even protesting. But now so many actors are also speaking up through flash mobs, through different ways. Again, saying that it shouldn't be like that. We haven't heard about many Russian regions because mostly the attention was to Moscow. But now they are doing live streaming through YouTube. YouTube is very, very big in Russia. It's like the main category under video, and they use it a lot. And many other things. When there is pressure on one, I don't know, university about their flash mob, more and more students start to do the same flash mob, and it's more and more. Again, it's you cannot live in fear all the time. You cannot think about it. But also it's important to think that it's one coin with two different sides, and why we think that the Kremlin, for example, is so strong with this, it's their cheap information attacks, because the Western democracies are susceptible to that. They start to believe that, and it was easy for the Kremlin to attack because of this vulnerability. So again, it's important to think about two coins, about thinking how we resist and what can we do, how we can use the experience of those who successfully resist to that.
Yeah, jump in on that. Yeah, so definitely there's a lot of self-censorship happening in China, and you'll if you have a look later at the paper, you'll see some examples of that. For instance, where VPN providers were incarcerated to show a message to other VPN providers and to instill fear. And then there's also laws of real name registration for blogs or for anyone who's reaching a certain amount of people. So that's definitely a big chunk of it is also of self-censorship in China. Although you might argue that there is comparatively more emphasis on censorship within China as compared to Russia. I had the opportunity to teach Chinese students at various points, and obviously there was a lot of self-constraint, right, during those teachings. But I think as soon as there was a bit of humor or a bit of irony, it loosened up a little bit, and there was kind of a bit of a more optimistic picture. Obviously, it's really a dire situation, and I don't think that fear will go away. And I don't know how this will be solved, but yeah, just like to add a personal anecdote to that.
Hi, my name is Eugene Steinberg. I'm from Facebook. I'm curious about...
I'm not sure. It's a little bit hard to hear up here.
Hi.
There we go. Thank you.
Hi. I was curious about your thoughts about how kind of Chinese surveillance export strategy, to what extent it's driven kind of by the private sector and where it sees it's like the best market opportunities, and to what extent it's driven by bigger government strategy about where it sees the best political opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if you look at the at those 102 countries that China exported to, and 70 of those were actual technology exports, you will see that there are a lot of it are some of them are state-owned companies like SAEC or other state-owned companies. You've got, especially as the regards to the sharing of techniques and of training of journalists, you've got a lot of government-related entities. You've got ministries involved in there. You've got, again, other state-owned companies which support those trainings, like Huaning Industry, and so on. And there is an interesting example, actually, which an annual forum happens each year in China on connecting domestic law enforcement to international law enforcement. And that's guided by the Ministry of Public Security. And as part of this event, Chinese companies showcase their products. There's ZTE, there's Huawei, and Maya Pico, and they actively pitch it to law enforcement abroad. So in those instances, you can see direct state guidance also on where those exports should be going, right? They should protect the Belt and Road Initiative. They should go into that direction, and companies do follow that advice.
We have time for, I think, one more question. Yeah, up here in the front.
Thank you. Nicholas Cook at the Congressional Research Service. I had sort of a technical question. You had this map, Valentin, it's a bit more extensive than the ones you were showing.
Oh, yeah.
What's the difference? And then for the other members of the panel, I was going to ask sort of who are the most problematic Western, or maybe not Western, but sort of rule of law oriented countries, firms from those countries, who are the most problematic commercial exporters of the kind of technology we're talking about here? I was sort of thinking of that question, but then also thinking it's not a very useful question because the interface between commercial big data and these surveillance technologies, they overlap so much. I mean, we have all these apps collecting all kinds of stuff on us every day. And so, thank you.
Yeah, so over here you can see both the core and the periphery of the technosphere. And that's a lot of superficial diffusion. That's maybe one safe city diffusing, one, let's say, some surveillance middle boxes diffusing. Some countries might have been trained, right? But then if you look, so that's the 108 countries, including Russia and China, 110. That's those countries, and you can see also both where China and Russia exported to, like there's like these like over parts, especially in Saudi Arabia, you can see in India and so on. But then if you look which countries have mostly been influenced either by Russia or by China, the core, those that have imported most technology, that have declared imitation, here also that have been trained. So, for instance, Egypt has been trained, they have received technology, and they have declared that they have imitated Chinese cybersecurity law. Similarly, for Iran, which has received training, it has said it will imitate, and it has received technology. So that's really the deepest diffusion has happened here, whereas the broad world is more of a shallow diffusion.
I could answer
Yeah, that'd be great.
So we talked a lot about NSO Group. I'll single out another company in this area, Canadian company called NetSweeper, which provides internet filtering services. So this is a company that started out by selling their technology to schools and libraries to prevent children or whatever people accessing content that is inappropriate in those settings. And then they realized that, well, there's a big market to do this at a national level, selling to large telcos. NetSweeper, we've done extensive reports on NetSweeper. They've also sued me and the University of Toronto for defamation. So read into that what you will in terms of my singling them out here. I'll just point you to our Planet NetSweeper report, which shows that they have reaped a harvest of sales to telcos situated within some of the most egregious rights-abusing countries, where their technology is being used to filter access to, among other content, women's health information, LGBTQ content. This is a Canadian company, so it gives you some indication of the nature of the problem that we're facing. As David said at the outset, this is not, just an authoritarian country problem. It's much more comprehensive than that.
In some respects, it ties to an earlier question about the drawing of lines, just
Exactly,
the bright
yeah.
lines, because, and also to the point about our own responsibility, right? Because there's so many different tools now that are being used for what we might put into a box that we call surveillance, and some of that we might not even think of as surveillance in the moment, like a targeted kind of surveillance, but it may be that a company that tracks locations at some point will be susceptible to a demand by a government for that kind of information. So, does that fall into this category or not? I mean, I think there's a good argument that it does, but this is also why I think drawing lines around what is and what isn't surveillance is going to be very difficult, and that we should be thinking a little bit more functionally and in terms of rule of law standards around control, rather than saying this kind of technology is in and this technology is out. It should be based on the function and the impact that it has on individual rights, on individuals, on organizations, and so forth.
Great. Well, we are just a little past time, actually, so I think we're going to wrap up. But thank you all for joining us today, for your recommendations on how we can combat this epidemic. Really appreciate you sharing your research as well, Valentin. Thank you to Seema and Ned for hosting this wonderful event, and for all of you to joining us as well. Thanks again.